Welcome back into the College Football 360 YouTube channel where I analyze every single angle of the best game known to man, that being college football. In today's episode, we continue our season in review series. This episode stars the Michigan Wolverines. The Wolverines obviously came into the season just fresh off of a national championship win. However, they did lose their coach, Jim Harbaugh, and many other coordinators and players. So naturally, they probably weren't going to win the national championship, but there was a certain level of expectation, and they ultimately fell under that expectation and went 7-5. However, they did end up winning their bowl game against the heavily favored Alabama Crimson Tide to make their record 8-5. We discuss this whole season and more on today's episode. We grade every single player. We look at the highs and lows of the season, and we look back on the 2024 season just as a whole. And then at the end, I give some improvements that I think this Michigan team can make in order to find more success in the next season. So what's up, guys? The only thing I would have you guys do right now is subscribe, as it is the best and most efficient way to support the channel. And let's just dive right in. Okay, so first off, I give you guys my overall thoughts on the season. This is not an all-inclusive list or whatever. These are just my general overall thoughts. This was the definition of a transitional year. You know, you're coming off of a national championship where you lost pretty much all of your players, a lot of your starting lineup, and you lost your coach, and a lot of the coaches in his staff went with him or just went elsewhere. Some to the Chargers in the NFL, some elsewhere. So, this wasn't going to be a transitional year. You have a lot of new coaches and a lot of new faces in. Sharon Moore is now your head coach. And I was expecting a little bit of this, but I wasn't expecting five losses. I'm going to tell you that for certain. The bowl win definitely saved the season. I think it would have been, if you go 7-6. I mean, you're on the level of Big Ten teams like Nebraska and Rutgers. So you don't, if you're Michigan, you don't want to be there. You don't want to be where they were last season. You don't want to be where they will be going forward. So the bowl win was pretty huge, in my opinion, for momentum, keeping guys around, and just providing some optimism to the program. Throughout the season, they never really had an offensive identity, and that started with the quarterback position. They couldn't decide who was going to play quarterback. It was just on a week-to-week basis who was going to play quarterback for them. Davis Warren had a good stretch. Alex Orji was here and there and everywhere. So, there was no offensive identity. Hopefully next year, when you have guys like either Mickey Keene or Bryce Underwood under center, you'll have a little bit more of an offensive identity, especially with Underwood if they start him. But they never had an offensive identity, and that was their downfall of the downfall of their offense. Also, not having any receivers helped there as well, to no offensive identity. But there were pieces to work with this offense. The offensive line was pretty good. The tight end Colson Loveland was really good. He'll be a day one or day two pick, and the running backs Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards were a pretty good tandem as well. But they just never had an offensive identity going throughout the season, and that's what derailed this season. And the defense did play well enough. I mean, they did win seven regular season games, and the defense was a huge part of why they won the bowl game, creating takeaways and whatnot. I mean, they have several stud players in that secondary, in the defense as a whole, starting in the secondary with, of course, Will Johnson. And then you had players up front like Kenneth Grant and just guys all over the place who played really well for this defense. And it kept them in games, and it won them games at times. So those are my overall thoughts on the season. Okay, so now we get to the position grades, starting with the offense, then we'll go to the defense, then we'll go to everyone as a whole. The coaching for the offense was a C, in my opinion. You have an offensive guy in Sharon Moore as your head coach. I expect a little bit better, they should have just stuck with the guy the whole season, through thick and through thin. I thought it should have been Alex Orji at the start of the season. I was wrong. He's not a very good quarterback, but hey, hopefully he finds success elsewhere. I think at UNLV, off the top of my head, that's where he went. Anyway, let me know if I'm right in the comments. I'm still not sure. But the coaching was a C. It was below average. C is below average for me. I don't give out F grades. I go on an A to D scale. So C is below average for me. B minus is about average. Just to give you a little bit of a say there. At quarterback, this is where I already talked about it, man. I really did not like their quarterback situation. It's the reason why their whole season was derailed, in my opinion, because they had so many different functioning parts going on. They never could decide on one. And Their quarterbacks in general, Davis Warren led the team in passing yards with 1,199. Jack Tuttle was in there for a little bit. He had threw for 306 yards. Alex Orgy threw for a buck 50. It just wasn't a good room at all. I mean, Orgy ran for 270 yards. He ran for a touchdown as well. It was just not a good room at all. I mean, Davis Warren had a QBR of 55.8. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns. It was not good. It was just not good. At running back though, let's get excuse me. Let's get a little bit more positive. I gave it a B. B plus. I couldn't decide between a B plus and a B. I mean, it was really just their whole offensive identity was what was just running the ball, if you could call it an identity. Khalil Mullings ran for about 950 yards. Donovan Edwards ran for 589 yards. People kind of wrote him off. He did end up performing reasonably well. But again, Mullings averaged 5.1 a carry and Edwards 4.6. So it wasn't like it was a burst or anything like that. Mullings was very good. But for the amount of times they ran the ball, I just, it's not worthy of anything higher than a B plus. I ended up going with a B here. Okay, so now we get to wide receiver. This was a D as well. I rarely give out D minuses, so D is typically my lowest grade. The wide receivers were not good at all. For the Wolverines, Tyler Morris led the wide receivers in yards with 248. That should tell you all you need to know, really. I mean, you have other guys like Samaj Morgan, who was out there. Their second wide receiver, who did not even get 140 yards, he had 139 and a touchdown. All their yardage came from Colson Loveland, which we will talk about here in a second. But I mean, this wide receiver room was was just downright terrible, and they need to fix it fast in order to get any sort of anything going. I mean, even people didn't really think that the wide receiver rooms were exceptional during their championship runs in 21, 22, and finally in 23. But they had a couple guys. I mean, they had Roman Wilson. They had guys that were NFL draft picks. I mean, Roman Wilson went, I think, in the third round, something like that. But that's just off the top of my head. Now we go to tight end in A here. Colson Loveland went for 582 yards, led the team in receiving touchdowns as well. He's just a force, man. 6'5", 245. He's just an absolute force, and he was really the only saving grace for any time they wanted to pass the ball. The offensive line I gave a B minus. And I would say that this is just about an average offensive line. They were really good in run support. I mean, the passing game is something else entirely. But they had guys like Josh Prebe at guard and Miles Hinton at tackle who were pretty darn good. And some of the other guys were great as well. I guess great's a strong word for it, but they were just about average. On offense, it was a different story, but on defense, it's an entirely different story. I mean, they were the definition of dominant, in my opinion. We'll start with the coaching. The coaching was an A. I thought that for what they had, they executed perfectly, and they were great, in my opinion. Let's get into this defensive line. Let's talk about them. I gave them an A grade as well. 3 of the 4 guys listed on this defensive line will be going to the draft, and obviously it is headlined by Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham. These guys were amazing. But let's talk about Josiah Stewart. Actually, Josiah Stewart is more of an edge player, so we'll talk about him. And he led the team in sacks with 8.5. 33 total tackles. He was the dominant force on the edge. And then obviously now we'll talk about, guys like Derek Moore. Derek Moore had a couple sacks. TJ Guy had a couple sacks as well. I think both of them combined had just about 10 sacks. Then you have Mason Graham. Mason Graham, obviously huge defensive lineman. He had 3.5 sacks, 46 tackles. Great in run support, great in pass support. 6'3", 220. One of the first guys off the board when it comes to defensive tackle position at the NFL draft. And then Kenneth Grant as well. I mean, he also had a couple sacks. 6'3", 339 pounds. He is an absolute force. And this defensive line gets an A grade. Okay, next we'll talk about The linebackers, I gave them a B plus. They were all right, I guess. They weren't spectacular. They weren't this game wrecking crew, but the combination of Ernst Hausman and Derek Moore were pretty darn good. Jay Sean Barham was in there as well. When it came to tackles, because that's where linebackers thrive. Ernest Hausman led the team in tackles with 89. The next guy up, Jay Sean Barham, had 66. Hausman is a very good player. He'll be a draft pick next year. Of course, he's coming back to the team this upcoming year, and he has a chance to become a stud linebacker with some offseason progressions and whatnot. But I don't think I can get higher than a B plus here at linebacker. They were just pretty okay. They did their job. They didn't do it flawlessly, obviously, but they were pretty darn good. At corner, this is pretty much just Will Johnson here. The other guys, Makari Page is pretty good. Zeke Berry was pretty good. But Will Johnson definitely oh my goodness, excuse me, highlights this room. So I give him an A minus here. I think that definitely Will Johnson brings this room up. Without him, I'd say this room is about a B plus. So that's how much that tells you there. And then at the safety position, Quentin Johnson and Rod Moore were exceptional. They were really good. So I give them an A grade. Okay, so let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about the highs of the season. They beat Ohio State again for the fourth year in a row. I mean, that is quite an accomplishment for Michigan. Yes, Ohio State was really good this season, obviously, but it was just a great win for the program, just to keep the everything high and light, I guess you could say there, so that things aren't so doom and gloom. And then they beat Bama again, which is great as well. Your last two games of the season, you beat Ohio State and Bama. So that is some great momentum for the offseason. I think that Michigan has a real chance of doing a lot of stuff next season. Again, all with the quarterback play in question, but you love to see it, and it's definitely a high of the season, that last two game stretch. And then multiple high level draft picks. You're going to have 3 first round picks, 3 first round picks, probably even 4, with depending on how Colson Loveland is graded. You have Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, excuse me, at the defensive tackle position, who will both be gone in the first round. Probably one of them at least within the top 10 picks. Will Johnson, definitely a top 10 pick, probably even a top 5 pick. So you have a lot of guys that are going to be really good players. And then you have other guys that will be scattered in throughout the draft, like guard Josh Prebe, running backs Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullings. Josiah Stewart is going to be in there as well, Quentin Johnson and Makari Page as well. You got a lot of NFL talent in this in this room, in this previous team. So, that's a great mark of success for a program. Okay, so now we got to talk about the lows of the season, since we just talked about the highs of the season. We'll get this out of the way real quick, and we're almost done with this episode. So thank you guys so much for sticking around. Let's just call it how it is. It was a terrible offense. We already talked about it, so I don't need to talk about it further, but it was a terrible offense, and it needs to change. And they lost in prime time to Texas. That was back before we saw this team, how we see them today. So, it was a pretty marquee matchup at the time. And, you lost in prime time to Texas in the big house, and it was just a terrible showing for your defense and your offense. Really, it was the only game where the defense was just not good at all. And then having 5 losses after winning the national championship game, just as a season, really, it was a low. This season, I think, in hindsight, is going to be considered a low of the Michigan State program history, after coming off of a national championship, doing that, and then what I expect in the next coming years, which is more success than what they had this year. Okay, so now we have reached the end of the video. This is my last segment, the improvements I'm looking for next season. Really quick, let's go through them. Bryce Underwood, the quarterback, will bring explosivity to the offense. This offense was extremely boring. This offense was everything you want to say about it. But what they did not have was explosive plays, and Bryce Underwood can do that with both his arm and his legs. He has a cannon of an arm, and he can run really fast as well. His pro comps are like Cam Newton. So I mean that should say what you're getting here in Bryce Underwood. And then keeping the defensive standard. I mean, they've had this defensive standard now for 5+ years where, you know, you're really, really top notch elite defensive program. So I want them to keep that to an extent. Obviously, you need to bring in some offense, but you can't be all defense. But keeping the defensive standard, I think, is an improvement that will be made. And then making the college football playoff. I mean, look, this team, if Bryce Underwood pays dividends, will make the college football playoff if they keep expanding from this season forward. I mean, they were 2 or 3 wins away this year from it. So I mean, I think Bryce Underwood can give you a couple games, and this offense will hopefully win a couple games then that they should win, unlike this past year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I know it's a lot, and I mean it's great. I've had fun making these videos. I've done a ton of teams so far. We've got a lot of Big Ten teams, SEC teams, all of them in the works. You know, maybe Colorado's thrown in there as well. Some Big Ten, some Big 12, and some ACC teams in this series. So if you like how this is formatted, go and watch some of my other videos. They're great on the channel, so just click on the channel. They'll be right there. And while you're at it, subscribe. I mean, it's the best and most efficient way to support the channel, like I said before. Share this video around to more college football fans like yourself. And, I mean, comment your thoughts down below. I want to know what you have to say. I have fun reading the comments. I have fun interacting with the comments. I interact with pretty much every single comment down there. With that being said, I will see you guys in the next one.